finding out that I was touring the world to deny the Armenian genocide. It's a very interesting comment. They're completely wrong. I have written 10 books, of which one is about Armenians. They are sometimes present in other books that I've written because all the Ottoman peoples are present. There are Armenians and Greeks and Bulgarians and Turks and Kurds and everyone else who was there. So to say that I am touring the world to deny the Armenian genocide is more than a little false. When we read this transcript of the television show, my wife and I sat down and remembered that I had last given a talk on Armenians 2 years ago. So it's very, very funny to read these things about oneself. So to set the record straight, I want to say, first of all, I do not say the Turks never massacred Armenians. In fact, in Melbourne and Sydney, when I gave talks, I gave instances and examples of where Turks had indeed done things, bad things in World War I, to Armenians, sometimes to others. But I also wish to say that we have to consider that Armenians also killed Turks and Kurds. And that what we need to have a balanced view that takes all those things into account. It is strange that this is called a pro-Turkish position. But nevertheless, it is a position that I think is historically accurate. I've noticed that here and in other places, the critics never seem to comment on what I actually say. What they talk about are slogans, polemics, not facts of history. And that when this topic comes up, when the relation of Turks and Armenians comes up, the facts are not mentioned. Facts are never given. So what I think we should be considering today is we should be talking about facts. And I will try to give a few salient points. Hopefully there will be discussion, questions. And I will leave the theory of genocide and the basic question of genocide for questions if you wish to talk about that. And so the first thing, the first thing I think we should understand is that the area that was called Armenia in the Ottoman Empire, the area called the Six Vilayets, and sometimes the area called Cilicia, which is down below that, was an area in which 3/4 of the people were Muslims. There was no such place as Armenia in the Ottoman Empire. Now, I think that's very important because when people say something should be created as they say it was before, this is just completely wrong. Right? This is a place that had a vast majority of Turks in the north and a vast majority of Kurds in the south, and Turks also in the west.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
Of course.
Just one simple question, just so I clarify this. Had there been any substantial Muslim migration to that area?
The main one took place in the 11th century. So, yeah, unquestionably. Although I should say I gave a talk once purely about population, a rather dull and boring talk, and I talked about the Armenian kingdoms who had been there before and how the population changed that early. And this Armenian professor stood up and said, "You're making a mistake, because just because the king was Armenian doesn't mean the people were." So, difficult. Together, the Armenians and the Turks lived for 800 years. 800 years in which things weren't perfect, but in which they lived side by side and managed to survive. Then things began to change.
Sorry, Professor, just to interrupt, just to let everyone know that those bells and the lights flashing mean that every MP must return to the chamber for a vote.
Sure. So do you want me to...
No, you keep going. I'm just saying in terms of the House of Reps, it's required that everyone must be there, so it's not an optional thing, and that's a feature of our parliament.
Oh.
So just to let you know why they've run off.
Well, but why can you stay?
I'm a senator.
Okay. Well, I will gladly, I will gladly stop for a while if you want, or just keep on going, whatever is preferable. All right. Let's get the next slide, please. Things began to change when Armenians in the Caucasus region and in the eastern Anatolian region began to side with Russians as Russians invaded the territories. Now, what you see in the map are what was a massive population exchange. When the Russians came into these areas, they expelled the Turkish and other Muslim populations. They forced them out, and in their place, they put Armenians. Now, this was not necessarily a sign of that all the Armenians were on the side of the Russians. Many were. Many actually fought on the side of the Russians in the Russian army. But many of them were simply attracted by the land that had been evicted, from which the Muslims had been evicted. Free land, they were offered to have very low taxes, and consequently Armenians from Iran and from eastern Turkey went into the areas that were taken over, and this caused a tremendous breach in what had been a reasonably amicable relationship up till then. The Armenians were now living in Turkish homes, and that meant that the Turks naturally were very resentful of that. It also meant that the Armenians could see that siding with the Russians gave them real benefits, and that being with the Turks might be a problem. So this kind of breach, this kind of break between the two happened at this time. We have one more slide there. It's simply a later on period. This includes in the 1877-78 war, we had once again a large-scale migration of Turks that were forced out of the area that today is actually back in Turkey again. Once again, Muslims and Armenians. When the Russians invaded that territory, Armenians joined the Russian army and fought with the Russians, and indeed provided policemen for the Russian army as they took over these territories. So as you can imagine, this caused quite a bit of ill will. And when the Russians left, large numbers of Armenians fled with them. They feared the Muslims' revenge. They feared that the Turks would take their revenge on them, and they probably were pretty accurate in that. That's probably exactly what would have happened. All right, if we can look at the next one. The other factor that changed things forever was Armenian nationalist revolution. There were two groups, the Hunchaks and the Dashnakhs. If you can see, these are the openly declared manifestos or the programs of these two revolutionary parties. We're not talking about anything secret here. We're talking about the open declaration that they intended to overthrow the Turkish government. In other words, the Turks had real reason from their own mouths to feel that this was what was to take place. Now, I want you to remember the population figures. What we are talking about here is people that wish to overthrow the government and create an apartheid state, a state in which 1/4 of the population rules over 3/4 of the population. So we are talking actually about something that has nothing to do with democracy or nothing to do with one man, one vote. We're talking about an apartheid state. Okay, you can see the next one. In the 1890s, Armenians revolted, of the Hunchak party, revolted all over eastern Anatolia. Major revolts in Van, Sassoon, Zeytun, Adana, and minor incidents in which sometimes hundreds of people were killed, minor incidents all over. The intention of these revolts was not to succeed in overthrowing the Ottoman government because they knew they couldn't do that. First of all, they were only 1/4 of the population. If the Muslims of the area, they could stop them without any problem. The Ottoman government could stop them without any problem. But the intention was, and actually carried out, the intention was to attack and to kill Kurds and Turks, and to cause them to, in revenge, kill Armenians. And indeed, this did take place in many places, in Erzurum, in the areas you see up there. Things like people would get up on rooftops on Friday, and when the Turks would go to the mosque, they would start to shoot the Turks, and then the Turks would, of course, take their revenge, not on the people that were doing the shooting, it's hard to catch them, but on regular old Armenians that might be in the marketplace. So this was successful in that they did cause Europeans and Americans to write all sorts of terrible things about Turks. But it was unsuccessful because it did not cause what they wanted. They wished to have the Europeans intervene. They wished to have Europeans come into the territory, take over the territories, and give them to the Armenians. They failed in this completely. They failed in this because the Europeans could not agree. The British thought that would be a fine idea, but not if the Russians take it. The Russians thought that'd be a fine idea, but only if we take it. And consequently, nothing happened. Nothing happened, not because the Armenians weren't successful. They were. I mean, they convinced everyone that what happened was going on. And I might say almost always wrong history. But because the Europeans couldn't agree, everything quieted down. The Dashnaq Party, on the other hand, the Dashnaq Party, after the failure of this, set on a policy of slowly developing the revolutionary potential. Importing people from Russia, importing guns in tremendous numbers. The Ottomans found caches of thousands and thousands of rifles and pistols, dynamite, grenades, everything you could think of to fight a guerrilla war with. And they only found perhaps 10% of what there actually was. It turned out later on that the Armenian rebels were very well equipped indeed. And the Dashnaq Party's plan was to wait until the Ottoman Empire was at war. They knew they could never defeat the Ottoman army by themselves, but they thought if they waited till the Ottoman Empire was at war, that they could succeed by siding with the Russians. I think this was probably a great misunderstanding on their part. I don't think the Russians ever deliberately helped anyone to become independent. The Russians wanted it for themselves. But the Armenians, revolutionaries, thought that that was the case. And they were supported by the Armenian population. The British, who were by no means friends of the Turks, the British consuls reported at the time that the entire Armenian population of the East and the Southeast were anticipating and waiting for the Russians to arrive. Now, it makes a certain amount of sense because they thought the Russians were going to win and they wanted to be on the winning side. In any case, everyone agreed that that was the case. When war came, the Dashnaq Party, the Armenian rebels, received the equivalent of $15 million to buy weapons and to support themselves just before the war began from the Russians. The Dashnaqs went up to Russia, collected the money, came back and used the money to help their revolution, which of course they had been ready for 20 years, they'd been preparing for. Next slide. When the war began, actually, the Ottoman intelligence and the conscription officers who were going around trying to make sure that people did their duty and enrolled in the army, Armenians were supposed to be in the army as well, they found that in that entire region that you see there, they found that there were virtually no Armenian young men who were able to serve because they had all left. They had either gone to Russia and joined the Russian troops, or else they had created bands called Chete bands, bands of guerrillas, in the area to fight the Ottomans. Next one, please. In eastern Anatolia, Armenians revolted basically all over. But they revolted, and the only way you can understand their revolt is that they were agents of the Russian army. Where they revolted was always where it would do most damage to the Ottoman war effort. So, for instance, what you see there in the red lines are the transportation system. You might say it doesn't look like many roads, and that's because there weren't many roads. Those are the real roads. Those are what they call the metal roads, the roads that could take cannon and could take big weapons and things, not little dirt roads, because those were pretty much useless. The Ottomans had to keep those roads open, and those roads were exactly where the Armenians attacked. The Ottomans needed to have telegraph communications. That was the lifeblood of an army. You had to have telegraphs. And what did the Armenians do? But tens of thousands of Armenian guerrillas and partisan troops attacked the Ottoman communication system. So much so that the Ottomans had to delegate whole divisions of troops. Instead of fighting the Russians, these divisions of troops had to come down and fight the Armenians. So, in my favorite example, which I won't give you too much of, in Van, the Russians, in the far southeastern there, I don't know if you can read Van, but it's right over from Iran, the Armenians in Van revolted. They seized the city of Van, the major city in southeastern Anatolia. They held it against their own government until the Russians could come down. They attacked when the Ottomans tried to hold the passes in the mountains that would keep the Russians from coming in. They were attacked from behind by the Armenians. so many Armenians that when one pass was attacked so that the Russians could come through, the Ottomans lost 400 soldiers in just one attack. 400 soldiers killed by Armenians so that the Russians could come through. At the same time, in the same area, when the Russians, actually even a little before the Russians came through, the major slaughter of Muslim civilians began. At first, mostly Kurds. And these were killed in tremendous numbers. And the killing kept on going in the city of Van. And once the Russians came in, all around the bottom area of Lake Van, as you can see there, the lake that's sort of next to Van, all around in that area, no Muslim who didn't escape was allowed to live. It was simply a matter of massacre. Now, people don't talk about this when they talk about massacres. But as a matter of fact, the first massacres actually were massacres of Muslims. And the first, what they call deportations, the first relocations of people were actually done by the Russians up in the north, not by the Ottomans. But of course, these things were never talked about. In Van, when the Russians managed to break the Ottoman lines and attack in the east, when the Russians managed to win the war in the east, I believe, and many other historians believe, they were able to do that because of the Armenian revolt. When the Russians came down and tried to attack through from Iran, they went down through Iran and came over to attack Van, not only were the passes a problem, as I mentioned, but in a great battle that the Ottomans fought with them at Dilman, it was a close thing, the kind of battle that the whole war turns on. The Ottomans lost, just barely lost. And the reason they lost was because there were 6,000 Ottoman troops in Van that had to stay there to fight the Armenians. Actually, that was needed to win the war. And because they weren't there, the Ottomans had to be in full retreat. There also are many other areas. In the area down where you see the Mediterranean Sea coming up, in the area that's called Cilicia, down in there, the Armenian groups actually offered the British 10,000 Armenian fighters if the British would invade that area. The idea was that the British should use their boats and their soldiers, they should invade. The Armenians would act in the mountains, cut the Ottoman supply lines, attack the Ottoman lines in every way they could, and they would help the British tremendously. The British, I hope no one here is too British, they were too stupid to take it because they wanted to have this other place called Gallipoli. They attacked in Gallipoli instead, and this was a perfect place to attack here. They would have cut the Ottoman lines, they would have cut the Ottoman Empire in two, they would have caused the Ottomans to be out of the war a year or two before they were. But the British refused to accept the Armenians. But the Ottomans knew.
Whereabouts is the Ottomans in relation?
I'm sorry?
Whereabouts is Gallipoli in relation to this map?
Where is it?
Yeah, where's Gallipoli? Where's
This area is, my hearing is very bad. So
He's asking where Gallipoli is in relationship
oh,
to the
yeah,
map.
that's what I'm about to show you. Gallipoli is here. I don't really have.
Keep going.
Yeah, maybe even over a little bit. Gallipoli is about
Where's the west?
I hear about the relationship between Gallipoli and the Armenians, and somehow there isn't any. There isn't any, except insofar as the same Ottoman army is, fighting in two different places. Well, in any case, the Ottomans knew. The Ottomans knew what was going on. The Ottomans could see not only that their army was being attacked by Armenians, and the Armenians were helping the Russians, but they could see that Ottoman civilians were being massacred. So this isn't just a matter of a political decision or a military decision. This is whether or not they can protect their own people. Because of that, the Ottomans decided to relocate the Armenians. They decided to, let's look at the next slide perhaps. They decided to move the Armenians to areas in Syria and in Iraq, mainly in Syria, because they feared treason. They obviously had good reason to do so. Confusion. No one could say the Ottomans were perfectly organized. Difficulty with protecting people. In some areas, they were attacked, undoubtedly, the caravans. But 80% of the Armenians who were relocated survived. That's the best statistics that we have. Now, 80% survived, which probably indicates they didn't intend to kill them all. But 20% dead is still, it's horrible. It's a very sad and horrible thing to have that kind of death. But that was by no means the worst death of Armenians. The worst death of Armenians took place, you see where it says 350,000 up there? When the Russians came in, and the Armenians obviously helped them in Van and other places, the Ottomans managed for a while to counterattack. They came back into Van, and when they did, the Armenians, as you might expect, fled as quickly as they could. 350,000 went up to Russia. And in Russia, even when the Russians came back, the Russians refused to let the Armenians go back with them. They refused to let the Armenians be fed on their own land. Half the Armenians, of those 350,000, half of them died. Half of them died of disease, starvation. So, in fact, a much lower percentage of those relocated died. They were better off. But that's not really important. The important thing is to look at all sides of this. Because, notice the big green lines there. When demographers, such as myself, when we talk about moving people like that, when we talk about it as something called forced migration. And forced migration is a simple idea. Someone holds a gun to your head and says, you will move. Or there's a war going on, and unless you're crazy, you run. Well, that's what happened, not just to Armenians, but also to all these Turks and Kurds. Many more Turks and Kurds. And the death of these people was many times greater than the death rate of Armenians. For instance, in the province of Van, where all this trouble took place, almost 2/3 of the Muslims were dead at the end of the war. 2/3. So we're talking about massive death rates. We're talking about tremendous amounts of death, and not just Armenians, but Turks, Kurds. At the end of the war, when the Armenian Republic tried to set up in the areas of Erzurum and Trabzon and other areas, the Ottoman army defeated them, and when the Armenians left precipitously, they killed every single man, woman, and child, Muslim man, woman, and child who was in their way, and I mean every single one. When the armies came through, they found the wells were full of corpses. They found that their horses couldn't go through the streets because there were piles of dead. I mean, horrible things. But it must be said, when the Armenians who couldn't get away, when the Muslim villagers, the Turkish villagers returned, they killed all of them too. There's no question. In revenge, they killed them all. So if we want to talk who's guilty, who's innocent, the answer is everyone. Every side, every group, guilty, innocent. But there's something I like to point out which is very important. And that is, what you see in front of you are the numbers of Turks and other Muslims, mostly Turks, who were convicted of crimes against Armenians. The Ottomans tried to follow the rule of law. For crimes against Armenians, they tried and many times hung the people who had done these things, including an Ottoman governor. They weren't perfect. A lot of people got away. No doubt about it. But how many Armenians or Russians who killed Turks, how many of them were ever tried and convicted? None. Not a single one. So if you want to accuse the Ottomans of genocide or massacre or whatever you want to do, you have to take a look at these things. Huh? People who intend to kill everyone don't put the people who do kill them on trial. They don't hang their own people for that. That's not the sort of thing that happens. But it's the sort of thing that the Ottomans did always. I don't expect that anyone is going to take only my analysis. I don't expect that anyone is going to do any more than realize that there are facts that contradict, that go against the usual story that's told of the history of the Turks and the Armenians, that there are facts that must be considered. I also hope that people will realize what must be done. that we should forget slogans, forget polemics, forget insults, and we should study the facts. We should have discussion, we should have debate, we should have scholars getting together, historians that are Turks, Armenians, and scholars that are neither one, like myself perhaps. We should be making a study that is like any other history. It should be a calm, rational analysis of the facts, because that, after all, is the only way that historians find the truth. Thank you. Now, I'd say the questions of, if anyone does come back in and they want to know anything that's on the slides, I'd be glad to explain. And I have, to say, I could talk about genocide, talk about any other thing that you wanted to consider. So please, questions. And if you don't ask questions, then I get to go home and have lunch.
Professor McCarthy,
Yes.
I want to ask a question so we can delay.
Yeah, but it sounds like you're a set-up job here. Who knows what you're going to ask?
No, it's a very, very innocent question. The whole genocide question you referred to, can you perhaps elaborate on that? What genocide is?
See why I say this seems like a set-up job, because I just happen to have the next slide be about genocide. Not intention, honest. One more through there, and just to consider the whole, because I did actually mention that I would talk about genocide, and I will. Most people that discuss genocide discuss what's called the United Nations Genocide Convention. And the United Nations Genocide Convention is what the main part of it is what you see up there in front of you, plus a couple of other definitions. Usually when people call something a genocide, they mean it follows this convention. If you read the convention, you'll notice that it is such an incredibly broad statement of man's inhumanity to man that it applies to almost anything you do. If I decide that I do not like Australians, and I hit an Australian in the jaw because he's an Australian, that is, under the UN Convention, genocide. If I decide that I don't like Australians, so I won't allow an Australian child to go to school, that's also genocide. Now, both those things are terrible. They're not very nice. But to say that they're genocide seems to be stretching things a bit. Because when people think of genocide, they don't think of that. They think of Hitler. When people think of genocide, they think of, let's go to the next slide. What they think of are more accurate definitions. To commit genocide, you have to intend to destroy an entire group.